The village that carried evil in its veins. The most morally corrupted bloodline of the Appalachians. This is not just a title. This is the terrifying reality of what was discovered in the autumn of 1967. Hidden deep within the forgotten valleys of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains kept secrets that should have never seen the light of day. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a visiting physician from Lexington, arrived in Harrow Creek on October 12, 1967, as part of a rural health initiative sponsored by the state government. The settlement consisted of 47 individuals living in dilapidated wooden structures scattered across a narrow valley, accessible only by a deteriorating dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. The autumn air was thick with moisture, and the golden leaves of the surrounding oak and maple trees created an almost beautiful contrast to what he was about to witness. The first family he encountered was the Crowleys. Martha Crowley, who appeared to be in her early 50s but claimed to be 32, greeted him at the door of a house that leaned precariously to one side. Her face was asymmetrical, with one eye positioned noticeably higher than the other, and her jaw protruded in an unusual manner that made speaking difficult. Her hands trembled constantly, and her fingers were webbed between the second and third digits. Inside the dim interior, lit only by kerosene lamps despite the late morning hour, Dr. Hartwell found her children. Thomas, age 14, sat in a corner rocking back and forth, unable to communicate beyond guttural sounds. His spine curved unnaturally, creating a pronounced hump on his back. His sister, Elizabeth, age 11, had partially fused fingers on both hands and legs of drastically different lengths, requiring her to crawl rather than walk. The youngest, Jacob, was 6 years old and appeared blind. His eyes clouded with a milky film, his head significantly smaller than normal for a child his age. Martha explained in broken, slurred speech that her husband was also her uncle. Her mother had married her grandfather after her grandmother died in childbirth. Her father was the product of siblings. She recounted this family tree as if describing the weather, with no awareness that anything was abnormal. Dr. Hartwell spent 3 days documenting what he found in Harrow Creek. The Hendersons lived in the next hollow over. James Henderson, age 28, had severe intellectual disabilities and facial features that seemed almost melted together. His nose nearly flat against his face, his ears positioned too low on his skull. His wife, Rebecca, was his first cousin. Their 4 children displayed a horrifying array of conditions: cleft palates so severe that eating was nearly impossible, club feet that had never been treated, seizures that occurred multiple times daily, and profound deafness. The Mercer family consisted of 3 generations living in a 2-room cabin. The patriarch, Elijah Mercer, age 61, had married his niece when she was 15 and he was 34 back in 1940. Their children had then married each other, and their grandchildren were now being raised by parents who were both siblings and cousins. The genetic consequences were catastrophic. Of the 12 grandchildren, only 5 had survived past infancy. Those who lived suffered from conditions Dr. Hartwell had only read about in medical textbooks: microcephaly, where the skull failed to grow properly, polydactyly, with extra fingers and toes that were non-functional, and severe skeletal deformities that left them unable to stand upright. The doctor discovered that every single family in Harrow Creek was interconnected, through multiple generations of close relation unions. Brothers had married sisters. Uncles had married nieces. First cousins were the most distant relationship anyone could remember. The isolation of the valley, combined with religious beliefs that outsiders were dangerous and that keeping the family pure was godly, had created a closed genetic pool that had been recycling the same DNA for over a century. On the evening of October 14, 1967, Dr. Hartwell sat in his vehicle, his hands shaking as he wrote his preliminary report by flashlight. The temperature had dropped, and he could see his breath in the cold mountain air. He had counted 31 individuals with severe physical deformities, 18 with profound intellectual disabilities, and 12 children under the age of 10 who would likely not survive to adulthood. Every single person he examined showed some evidence of genetic abnormality. The social worker who had accompanied him, Patricia Fleming, had become physically ill on the second day and refused to continue the visits. She sat in the car now, crying quietly, unable to process what they had witnessed. This was not poverty. This was not neglect. This was the biological consequence of generation after generation of forbidden unions, creating a bloodline so corrupted that normal human development had become impossible. Dr. Hartwell made a decision that night. He would report everything to the Kentucky State Health Department. He would demand intervention. He would expose what had been hidden in these mountains for far too long. But as he prepared to leave Harrow Creek the next morning, an elderly woman approached his vehicle. Her name was Sarah Crowley, and she was 83 years old. one of the few in the settlement who could speak clearly. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength and said words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You think we're the only ones, Doctor? There are 3 more valleys just like ours. And nobody ever cared before. Nobody will care now." Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because the stories we uncover here are the ones history tried to bury. The truths that make us question how far human isolation can push the boundaries of survival. And you won't find these revelations anywhere else. The report Dr. Hartwell submitted on October 20th, 1967, landed on the desk of Dr. Margaret Osworth, the director of the Kentucky Division of Maternal and Child Health. What she read made her question whether this was an elaborate hoax. The descriptions seemed too extreme, too impossible for modern America. But the photographs accompanying the report told a different story. Black and white images showed children with faces that barely resembled human features. Adults whose bodies had been twisted into shapes that defied normal anatomy, and living conditions that belonged to a different century. By November 3, 1967, a team of 7 specialists had been assembled: 3 physicians, 2 social workers, 1 geneticist from the University of Kentucky, and a representative from the state attorney general's office. They arrived in Harrow Creek on a cold, gray morning when the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, coating the mountains in white and making the narrow road even more treacherous. Dr. Richard Pemberton, a geneticist who had studied hereditary disorders for 20 years, took the lead in documenting the family connections. What he discovered went beyond anything he had encountered in his career. Using handwritten records kept by some of the older residents, birth records from a small Baptist church that serviced the area until 1952, and extensive interviews, he began to map the genealogy of Harrow Creek. The settlement had been founded in 1847 by 3 families: the Crowleys, the Hendersons, and the Mercers. They had come from Virginia, seeking isolation in the Kentucky mountains for religious reasons. They practiced a fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity that emphasized separation from the outside world and preservation of family purity. By 1870, the community had grown to roughly 60 individuals. But then the pattern began. Marriages started occurring exclusively within the settlement. By 1890, every union was between first cousins at the very least. By 1910, uncles were marrying nieces, and in some cases, half-siblings were entering into relationships that produced children. The isolation became self-reinforcing. As genetic problems began to appear, the families became more ashamed and more determined to hide from outsiders, which only intensified the closed breeding pattern. Dr. Pemberton's charts showed family trees that looped back on themselves in impossible ways. One man, Daniel Mercer, born in 1923, was simultaneously the grandson, nephew, and cousin of Elijah Mercer. His mother had been the product of Elijah's relationship with his own daughter. When Daniel grew up, he married his half-sister, and their children displayed some of the most severe deformities in the entire settlement. The medical examinations conducted in November 1967 revealed conditions that shocked even the experienced physicians. Clara Henderson, age 19, had been born with her internal organs partially reversed, a condition called situs inversus, likely caused by the extreme genetic similarity of her parents. She also had a severe heart defect that caused her lips and fingernails to remain perpetually blue from lack of oxygen. She had never been seen by a doctor before this visit. The Crowley twins, Matthew and Mark, age 16, were joined at the hip until they were separated in a crude procedure performed by their grandfather when they were infants. The separation had been done without medical supervision, using tools from the farm, and both boys had survived despite massive infection risk. They now lived with 1 leg each, unable to walk without assistance, their bodies scarred from the primitive operation that should have killed them. Dr. Pemberton collected blood samples from 42 individuals, marking each carefully with identification numbers. The samples were sent to the University of Kentucky laboratory for analysis. While genetic testing as we know it today did not exist in 1967, blood typing and basic hereditary markers could still reveal the degree of genetic similarity between individuals. The results, which arrived in mid-December, confirmed what everyone already knew. The level of shared genetic material was consistent with immediate family relationships across the entire population. The social workers, Janet Price and Robert Coleman, focused on living conditions and family dynamics. What they discovered was a community that had created its own twisted logic to justify what was happening. The older residents spoke of keeping the bloodline pure as a religious duty. They quoted scripture out of context. claiming that their isolation was righteous and that the physical afflictions were tests from God to strengthen their faith. But the younger residents told a different story. Emily Mercer, age 24, one of the few who could read and write, confessed to Janet Price that she had tried to leave when she was 17. She had walked the 12 miles to the nearest town, hoping to find work and a different life. But her family had found her within 2 days and brought her back. 6 months later, she was forced into a union with her cousin. She now had 3 children, 2 of whom could not walk and 1 who had never spoken a word. The state attorney general's representative, Thomas Blackwood, faced a legal nightmare. What laws had been broken? Kentucky had statutes against marriage between close relatives, but these unions had occurred over decades, and many of the participants were themselves victims of a system created long before they were born. How do you prosecute an entire community? How do you separate victims from perpetrators when everyone is both? On December 18, 1967, the investigation team held a meeting in Lexington to determine their recommendations. The evidence was overwhelming. Harrow Creek was a genetic disaster, a human tragedy created by isolation, religious extremism, and generation after generation of forbidden unions. But the solution was far from clear. Removing the children would destroy the only families they had ever known. Forcing sterilization would be ethically impossible and legally questionable. And yet allowing the pattern to continue seemed equally unconscionable. Dr. Osworth made the decision to go public. On January 9, 1968, the Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story with the headline, "Hidden Valley Reveals Century of Inbreeding." The article, while carefully worded to protect identities, described the conditions in Harrow Creek and the state's discovery of what had been happening. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The article sent shockwaves across Kentucky and eventually the entire nation. By January 15, 1968, reporters from newspapers as far away as New York and California were attempting to reach Harrow Creek. The state government, overwhelmed by media attention and public outrage, established roadblocks to prevent unauthorized access to the settlement. But the story was out, and America was both horrified and fascinated. What the journalists discovered through their research was that Harrow Creek was not unique. Dr. Osworth's team, encouraged by the attention, began investigating reports of similar isolated communities throughout the Appalachian region. By February 1968, they had identified at least 6 other settlements in eastern Kentucky alone where closed breeding patterns had created genetic catastrophes. The most shocking was a community called Stillwater Hollow, where every single resident born in the past 30 years had some form of physical or cognitive disability. Back in Harrow Creek, the residents reacted to the exposure with a mixture of shame, anger, and confusion. Many of the older generation refused to speak with the social workers who were now visiting weekly. They saw the intervention as persecution, as an attack on their way of life and their religious beliefs. Elijah Mercer, the patriarch who started his own family through a union with his niece, stood outside his cabin in the freezing February wind and shouted at the vehicles bringing supplies and medical aid, "We didn't ask for your help. We didn't ask to be put on display like animals." But the younger residents, particularly the women, began to tell their stories. Rebecca Henderson, whose children suffered from multiple severe conditions, broke down during an interview with social worker Janet Price on February 22, 1968. She described how she had been forced into her union with her cousin when she was just 14 years old. She had begged her parents to let her attend the high school in the nearest town 12 miles away, but they had refused. By 15, she was expecting her first child. By 18, she had 3 children, all with devastating health problems. "I never wanted this," Rebecca said, her voice barely above a whisper, her asymmetrical face wet with tears. "I never wanted to bring children into this world knowing what would happen to them, but what choice did I have? Where could I go? Who would take me in looking like this?" The medical team that had been providing care since January made a disturbing discovery in early March 1968. Sarah Crowley, the 83-year-old woman who had warned Dr. Hartwell, had kept detailed diaries dating back to 1922 in these handwritten journals. She had documented births, unions, and deaths in the settlement. What the pages revealed was a systematic pattern of coercion and control that had kept the closed breeding cycle going for generations. Young women who expressed interest in outsiders were confined to their homes. Men who tried to leave were threatened with violence. Children who were born with the most severe deformities were hidden away, never allowed outside their houses, sometimes kept in root cellars or attic spaces. Sarah had recorded at least 15 instances where newborns with extreme abnormalities had died within days of birth, though whether from natural causes or deliberate action was impossible to determine from her entries. The diary also revealed something even more disturbing. The religious justification for the isolation was not traditional fundamentalist Christianity, but rather a twisted doctrine created by the settlement's founder, Nathaniel Crowley, in the 1850s. He had preached that mixing with outsiders would corrupt the soul, that physical affliction was a sign of spiritual testing, and that those who remained faithful despite suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife. This belief system had been passed down through generations, becoming more extreme with each passing decade. On March 14, 1968, the state of Kentucky held a public hearing in Frankfort to determine what actions should be taken. The hearing room was packed with journalists, medical professionals, religious leaders, and concerned citizens. Dr. Pemberton presented his genetic findings, explaining in terms that non-scientists could understand how the repeated close relation unions had created a population where harmful recessive genes had become dominant. Every human carries genetic mutations, Dr. Pemberton explained, holding up charts that showed the family connections in Harrow Creek. Most of these mutations are harmless because we inherit different versions from each parent. But when parents are closely related, the chance that a child will inherit the same harmful mutation from both parents increases dramatically. In Harrow Creek, we're seeing the compounding effect of this happening over 5 generations. The genetic diversity that protects normal populations simply doesn't exist here. He presented photographs, carefully selected to be impactful without being exploitative. Images of children with cranial abnormalities, skeletal deformities, and developmental disabilities filled the screen. The audience sat in stunned silence. This was happening in America in 1968, in communities that were just hours away from modern cities. Dr. Margaret Osworth then presented her recommendations. The state would offer voluntary relocation assistance to any families who wished to leave Harrow Creek. Medical care would be provided free of charge to all residents. Educational programs would be established for the children who could benefit. And most controversially, the state would offer family planning education and resources to prevent future pregnancies within the settlement. The debate that followed was heated. Religious groups argued that the state had no right to interfere with family structures, even if those structures were causing harm. Medical professionals countered that allowing the situation to continue was ethically impossible. Legal experts questioned whether any intervention could be enforced without violating constitutional rights. This is the moment where we must pause and reflect. If this story has moved you, if you've felt the weight of what these families endured, leave a comment with the words that Rebecca Henderson whispered to the social worker through her tears. "I never wanted this." Let those 4 words represent the countless victims of isolation and genetic tragedy who never had a voice. By June 1968, the state's intervention program was in full operation. A medical clinic had been established in the nearest town, staffed by volunteer physicians and nurses. Social workers made weekly visits to Harrow Creek, offering counseling and resources. Educational materials about genetics and family planning were distributed, though many of the older residents refused to even look at them. The response from the community was mixed and painful. 12 families, primarily younger couples with children, accepted the relocation assistance. They moved to subsidized housing in Lexington and surrounding towns, where they could access medical care and their children could attend schools with special education programs. The transition was brutal. These families faced discrimination, stares, and whispers wherever they went. Children who looked different were bullied mercilessly. Adults struggled to find employment. Emily Mercer, who had tried to escape years earlier, was one of those who relocated. In an interview conducted in September 1968, she described her new life with cautious optimism. Her children were receiving medical treatment. The youngest, who had never spoken, was working with a speech therapist. But Emily herself struggled with depression and overwhelming guilt. She had left behind her parents, her siblings, and the only world she had ever known. "I look at my children and I see what I did to them," she said, her voice breaking. I knew what would happen, but I couldn't stop it. And now I'm supposed to be grateful that someone finally noticed? That someone finally cared enough to help? Where were they 20 years ago? Where were they when my mother was forced into the same situation? Meanwhile, in Harrow Creek, the families who remained became more insular. Elijah Mercer, the patriarch, organized the resistant families into a unified front. They refused medical examinations, refused educational programs, and made it clear that social workers were no longer welcome. By October 1968, the state's access to the settlement had been almost entirely cut off. The situation reached a crisis point on November 3, 1968, exactly 1 year after the investigation team had first arrived. A 5-year-old child named Lucas Crowley died from complications related to a heart defect that could have been treated with surgery. His parents had refused to allow him to be taken to a hospital, believing that his suffering was God's will. The state attempted to file charges, but prosecutors struggled to build a case that could withstand legal challenges. Dr. Hartwell, the physician who had first discovered Harrow Creek, visited Emily Mercer in Lexington in December 1968. He wanted to understand if the intervention had been worth the pain it had caused. Emily's answer was complicated. "You saved my children's lives," she told him. "But you couldn't save their childhoods. You couldn't give them back normal bodies. You couldn't erase the damage that was already done. And the people still in Harrow Creek? They hate you. They see you as the enemy, not the savior. So was it worth it? I don't know. I honestly don't know." By early 1969, the media attention had died down. The public moved on to other stories, other scandals. The state continued to offer services, but funding became harder to secure. The medical clinic reduced its hours. Social worker visits became monthly instead of weekly. Harrow Creek faded back into obscurity, still isolated, still practicing the same patterns that had created the tragedy in the first place. Dr. Pemberton published his genetic research in a medical journal in March 1969. The paper, titled "Genetic Consequences of Prolonged Endogamy in an Isolated Appalachian Community," became one of the most cited works in population genetics. But for the people of Harrow Creek, it was just another example of outsiders using their suffering for academic purposes. The children who had been relocated made slow progress. Some adapted to their new environments and thrived as much as their conditions allowed. Others never adjusted and lived in constant longing for the mountains and the families they had left behind. The psychological trauma of being removed from everything they knew, combined with the physical challenges they faced, created a generation of individuals caught between two worlds and fully belonging to neither. By 1975, 7 years after the initial discovery, Harrow Creek had shrunk to fewer than 30 residents. Some had died from medical conditions that went untreated. Others had quietly left in the middle of the night, seeking anonymity in distant cities where no one knew their history. The few who remained were mostly elderly, stubbornly clinging to the only life they had ever known. The settlement's infrastructure had deteriorated even further. The old church where Nathaniel Crowley had preached his doctrine of isolation had collapsed during a storm in 1972. The school building, which had been closed for decades, was now just a shell filled with debris and memories. The houses leaned at dangerous angles, their foundations crumbling, their roofs full of holes. Sarah Crowley, the woman who had kept the diaries, died in January 1976 at the age of 91. She was the last person who remembered the settlement in its early days, before the genetic consequences became impossible to ignore. Her death marked the symbolic end of an era. The few remaining residents buried her in the small cemetery on the hillside where 5 generations of Crowleys, Hendersons, and Mercers lay beneath simple wooden markers. The relocated families faced their own struggles with legacy and identity. The children born in Harrow Creek grew into adults who had to navigate a world that saw them as medical curiosities or objects of pity. Many chose to hide their origins, inventing new family histories that didn't include the truth of where they came from. Others embraced their past as a form of activism, speaking publicly about the dangers of isolation and the importance of genetic diversity. Rebecca Henderson, whose story of being forced into a union at 14 had moved so many during the hearings, became an advocate for children in isolated communities. Despite her own health challenges and the demands of caring for her disabled children, she worked with social service agencies to identify other settlements where similar patterns might be occurring. Her efforts led to the discovery of 3 additional communities in Tennessee and West Virginia where intervention was desperately needed. Dr. Hartwell continued his rural medical practice but never forgot what he had witnessed in Harrow Creek. He testified before Congress in 1977 as part of hearings on rural healthcare access, using the settlement as an example of what happens when communities become completely disconnected from modern medical knowledge and resources. His testimony contributed to increased funding for rural health programs, though he always felt it was too little, too late. The scientific legacy of Harrow Creek extended far beyond Dr. Pemberton's initial research. The case became a cornerstone study in medical genetics, cited in textbooks, and used to educate new generations of physicians about the importance of genetic counseling and the dangers of consanguinity. The blood samples collected in 1967, stored carefully at the University of Kentucky, were later used in groundbreaking research on genetic disorders when more advanced testing became available in the 1980s. But perhaps the most important legacy was the awareness that Harrow Creek brought to the issue of isolated communities and genetic health. The case forced American society to confront an uncomfortable truth, that even in a modern, developed nation, there were pockets of such extreme isolation that medieval patterns of behavior persisted with devastating consequences. By 1980, Harrow Creek was effectively abandoned. The last few residents had either died or moved away. The valley returned to nature, the buildings slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Vines grew through broken windows. Trees sprouted through collapsed roofs. The dirt road that had once been the only connection to the outside world became overgrown and impassable. Hikers who stumbled upon the ruins in subsequent decades found it hard to believe that people had lived there so recently. The settlement looked ancient, like something from a much earlier century. Occasionally, curiosity seekers would explore the site, finding old photographs, handwritten letters, and other artifacts that hinted at the human tragedy that had unfolded there. Emily Mercer, who had been one of the first to relocate, visited the abandoned settlement in 1985. She walked through what remained of her childhood home, now just a skeleton of rotting wood. She stood in the cemetery and read the names on the markers, so many of them children who had died young. She thought about her own children, now adults, who had survived and built lives despite the challenges they faced. This place was a prison, she said to the journalist who had accompanied her, wanting to document the long-term aftermath of the story. But it was also home, and that's the hardest part to reconcile. How do you hate something and miss it at the same time? How do you be grateful for escaping while mourning what was lost? The descendants of Harrow Creek, scattered across the country, carried their heritage in their genes and in their memories. Some have children of their own now, born from unions with people from diverse backgrounds. Their genetic profiles much healthier as a result. These children represent hope, proof that the cycle can be broken, that genetic diversity can be restored in just a single generation, but the physical and emotional scars remain. The adults who were children in Harrow Creek still struggle with their health conditions. Many require ongoing medical care. Some cannot work due to their disabilities. The psychological impact of their childhoods, of growing up in such isolation and witnessing so much suffering, manifests in depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming relationships. The story of Harrow Creek serves as a stark reminder of what happens when communities become completely isolated. When fear of outsiders combines with distorted beliefs to create closed systems that perpetuate harm generation after generation. It demonstrates the biological reality that humans require genetic diversity to thrive, that we are strongest when we connect with those different from ourselves. The village that carried evil in its veins was not evil because of the people who lived there, but because of the system that trapped them, the isolation that imprisoned them, and the ignorance that allowed their suffering to continue for so long. The real evil was the silence, the decades when no one cared enough to look beyond the mountains and see what was happening in those hidden valleys. Today, Harrow Creek exists only in medical journals, in archived newspaper articles, and in the memories of those who lived through its final years. The valley is quiet now, home only to wildlife and the ghosts of a community that destroyed itself through the very thing it thought would preserve it, keeping the bloodline pure. If you've watched until the end, you've witnessed one of history's most devastating examples of how isolation and misguided beliefs can corrupt not just minds, but bodies and entire bloodlines. Check if you're subscribed to this channel, because we bring you the stories that history tried to bury, the truths that challenge everything we think we know about family, community, and survival. If you watched until here, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Hit the like button if this story impacted you and made you think differently about the importance of connection and diversity. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from outsiders, but from walls we build to keep them out.